From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and a teacher living in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. In fact, I think about half of Florence has the flu this week, myself included. Be that as it may, behold, I have returned with another episode. And so, the art history podcasts are at a bit of a crossroads as we approach the middle of the 18th century. Until now, it's been pretty easy to chart the evolution of sculpture, if you want to call it that, as it seems that each evolving style relates to what has come before it. We can understand, just by looking at sculpture, how the Mannerist arose from the High Renaissance, for example, and how the Baroque arose from the Mannerists. Likewise, French Baroque style during the reign of Louis XIV came from Roman Baroque, and the Rococo style during the reign of Louis XV is just sort of a Louis XIV style fallen into decadence, and so on and so forth. But a new era of sculpture, Neoclassicism, which seems to have spontaneously generated all over Europe in the 1780s, can't be explained in the same way. Neoclassicism didn't evolve from the Rococo. In fact, in part, it was a reaction against it. But it was more than just a reformation in art. It was a revolution. It's as though Europe hit the reset button on art history and got rid of everything they thought they knew about art and started over. I think it's a bit difficult for the newcomer to art history to figure out what was so special about Neoclassicism. I mean, I certainly, personally, wasn't drawn to it immediately. Canova, he's not my favorite. And even when I had gotten a real interest in art history and learned the basics, I found that the idea of Neoclassicism a bit silly. I mean, after all, artists have been emulating the Greeks and the Romans since the early Renaissance. What is so neo about Neoclassicism? Michelangelo was a classicist. Bernini, in his own way, was also a classicist. Artists have been drawing themes from ancient sources and copying forms from ancient statues for centuries. And the Académie Royale in Paris had just turned the study of the ancients into the law of the land for artists. So why isn't Neoclassicism just more of the same? Well, I like to look at it in terms of causes and effects. And one way to put it is that classicism is emulation of the effects of the art of the ancients, and Neoclassicism is in alignment with the causes of the art of the ancients. Now, if that makes no sense to you now, don't worry. I'm going to spend the rest of the podcast episode explaining exactly what I mean. And to do that, I'm going to have to talk about what was going on in the wider world of the 18th century, well beyond the bounds of what sculptors and painters were up to. Because if Neoclassicism is anything, it is a reflection of the times in which it was produced, a product of the politics, philosophies, literature, and society of Europe in the 18th century. It's a reflection of the series of social-political upheavals which took place at this time, the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Now, it would have been convenient for art historians if artists of the 18th century had the thoughtfulness to spend their careers either on one side or the other of these tumultuous events, speaking chronologically. But the most notable sculptors of this time, like Jean-Antoine Houdon and Antonio Canova, came of age and were trained in the older styles of the Baroque and the Rococo, but later were heavily influenced by neoclassic thought and style. Both sculptors that I just mentioned lived through the Revolution and even outlasted the Emperor Napoleon's tumultuous reign. So to talk about the full careers of either of these sculptors, we really need to understand the changes that took place in their worlds. So let's begin with the Enlightenment. Now, the name itself, the Enlightenment, seems to imply some sort of epiphanic moment, some lightning bolt out of the sky which bestowed reason and logic upon the benighted minds of the 18th century. Well, far from it. What we call the Enlightenment was actually a whole litany of changes in education, in thinking, political philosophy, scientific advances, and even seemingly obscure social developments like the rising popularity of coffee drinking in coffee houses. And all these contribute to the phenomenon of the Enlightenment. It doesn't really have a defined start date or an end date. It's akin to a slowly rising tide. Some say the seeds of the Enlightenment were sown as far back as 1650, and some say much later. It's really a question without an answer. And also, just so you know, I'm only going to touch very lightly on these various factors of the Enlightenment and go into detail absolutely nowhere, except where it concerns the arts. There are books upon books about the topic you can read for a more thorough understanding of the Enlightenment. For our immediate purposes, we just need to see it as a general backdrop to the scene. So, in the most general sense, what we can say is that the Enlightenment wouldn't have occurred without the rising literacy rates and availability of books in Europe. People were reading, and they were no longer limited to just reading the Bible. Works by philosophers were especially popular, and were discussed and debated on many levels of society, including nobility and royalty in several nations in Europe. Works by John Locke or David Hume, Voltaire, Francis Bacon. Also, scientific texts, such as work by Isaac Newton, were also widely read and discussed. And the things that these philosophers were talking about, and by the way, Isaac Newton was called a natural philosopher, as the idea of science being something separate from philosophy had not yet occurred. Now, these things that these people in books were talking about were questions more or less concerning the fundamental nature of things. Why is the world like it is? What are the universal principles which govern the world? Can these principles change or evolve? Can we make the world a better place? For instance, is the way the world is run by absolute monarchs, by world religions, by some elite central authority, is this the best way the world can work? Or are there other ways? Ironically, it was the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV that made a lot of this new thought possible. Just as the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture improved the standards and tastes of painters and sculptors during his reign, another of Louis's projects, the Académie Française, improved the quality of scholarship, research, and general academic and scientific pursuits. The Academy of Science in Paris actually predates even the Académie Royale. The institutions that were put into place under Louis XIV's monarchy would eventually be the monarchy's downfall, although Louis XIV himself would be long dead before then. And these books and these ideas were talked about not in taverns and saloons, but in a new fashionable place to meet and congregate, which became crucial to the spread of new ideas, the coffee house. Now, at first blush, it might sound silly that a part of the Enlightenment is due to people getting jacked up on coffee rather than drunk on beer. But the argument of stimulant versus depressant, that's only the tip of the coffeehouse iceberg. Coffee houses became focal points for new ideas and the spreading of these new ideas. They were democratic institutions, for one thing, right? Aristocrats and commoners alike would frequent them, and the classes mingled on a social level in a way that they were not allowed to elsewhere. Now, this idea of an egalitarian meeting ground actually disturbed the nobility and the royalty of France and England and elsewhere, but their popularity was also impossible to stop. Coffee houses became the place where one could go and listen to the ideas and opinions of others, spread good ideas or spread gossip, and even become a place where lessons could be informally taught. One art historian argues that English coffee houses developed into what he calls penny universities. In fact, the first coffee house ever opened up in Oxford in 1650, and it was a meeting house for scholars and those who wished to educate themselves but were not university students. And things happened there in these coffee houses. Ideas were born there, like Diderot's Encyclopedia, a volume of books containing the sum of knowledge. Societies dedicated to self-discovery and discovery of the world were born there as well, like, well, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, various debating societies. Now, if I could compare the rise of the coffee house to anything, it seems fitting to compare it to the rise of the internet. Never before did the average person have easy access to information and opinion and new ideas both mainstream and on the fringe, unfiltered and unregulated by those in national power. By the way, despite all the conspiracy theories behind such groups as the Masons and the Illuminati, they really were just another social movement, a sort of a niche social movement within the larger context of the Enlightenment. The Illuminati were more or less similar to, say, the internet group Anonymous. Both groups, both the Illuminati and Anonymous, are overtly political, with a penchant for projecting more power than they actually wield. Now, I could go on and on about the Enlightenment and its almost endless supply of good stories and interesting developments, but I need to stick to the basics for the purposes of this podcast. So in a sentence, I'm going to reduce the Enlightenment to a time when new ideas were examined in the cold light of reason, unencumbered as much as possible by religion or the status quo, combined with the effective and egalitarian dissemination of these ideas through books and new social groups like coffee houses and clubs and societies. Now, how does art fit into this picture? Well, that's just what we shall discuss when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners, just a quick shout out for my new sponsor. In case you haven't heard the good news, the sculptor's funeral is now brought to you in part by Blick Art Supplies, the oldest and largest supplier of professional art supplies in America. Everything a sculptor needs, from your favorite clay modeling tools, modeling stands, armature supplies, clays, plasters, molding and casting supplies, and materials. They have it all, and the shipping in the U.S. is free on most items if the order is over $100. And best of all, ordering your supplies from Blick Art Supplies directly supports the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. Just go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com. Click on any of the Blick buttons you find on the home page or on the episode pages, and shop away. A percentage of your purchase goes to support the show, and it's very much appreciated. So the next time you need art supplies, click on Blick, and thanks. All right, we're back, and we're discussing the dissemination of rational research into the world known as the Enlightenment. Now, some of these new ideas concern artists a great deal, and the most influential of these ideas, by far, arose from the mind and research of one man, a humble tutor and librarian by the name of Johann Joachim Winckelmann. Born into poverty in Germany, Winckelmann showed a high degree of promise as a student and first studied theology and then medicine. However, his real interest lay in the classics, both Greek and Roman art and literature. However, he found that his many questions he had about the Greeks and the Romans soon exhausted the knowledge of his teachers and of the books he could find on the subject. And after several years of working as a tutor, Winckelmann landed a job as a librarian for a bookish German count and his private library. And it was here, in this private library, that Winckelmann was able to catch up not only on gaps in his reading on the subject of classic art and literature, but he was also exposed to a lot of contemporary writers as well, Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, such as Voltaire. Winckelmann also befriended several artists and several local scholars who encouraged Winckelmann's studies and interests in art. The end result of this was the publication of Winckelmann's first book, called, in English, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture. It was a review of sorts of Greek art as a whole, and it at once reveals Winckelmann as someone who understands the work of the Greeks on a level that few others did, and communicates his understanding and interpretation of Greek work in a beautiful written style. It became a bestseller, and it was much discussed by artists all over Europe and by other people as well, and it effectively planted the seeds for what was to become the neoclassical style in both painting and sculpture. The book, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Works in Painting and Sculpture, lays out a new way of approaching the work of the Greeks that would transform the way European artists approach classicism forever. So what does this little essay say? Well, Winckelmann gets right to the point. Here's a slightly abbreviated quote that really just sums up the heart of the entire essay. The only way, and I'm quoting here, the only way for us to become great, or, if this be possible, inimitable, is to imitate the ancients. What someone once said of Homer, that to understand him well means to admire him, is also true for the artworks of the ancients, especially the Greeks. One must become as familiar with them as with a friend. Okay, so nice little tight little quote. The only way for us to become great is to imitate the ancients, right? Study and imitate the Greeks because they were really, really good. People were doing that for centuries anyway, right? But here's the thing. Winckelmann wasn't talking about merely making your statues look like Greek statues. For Winckelmann, the look and the style of Greek art was the outcome of the way the Greeks approached art, right? The style and the look was an effect. Winckelmann explains that the Greek style was the product of Greek thinking. When Winckelmann says imitate the Greeks, what he means is you gotta think like a Greek. If you strive for what the Greeks strove for in their art, the natural result is going to be the classic Greek style. So this really is in contrast to what classicism had really been up to this point. Right? Remember back in the Renaissance, when sculptural technique was still emerging from the Gothic period? Classical statuary was used more or less as a model or a standard at which to aim, right? Just arriving at the technical proficiency that the Greeks and the Romans had been capable of was an achievement all to itself. But it was physical imitation, not philosophical assimilation. I mean, no matter how much of a Neoplatonist you were. Little thought was given to the reasons why the Greeks sculpted like they did, beyond it being beautiful and tasteful. Besides, the Greeks were pagans, and perhaps it was better not to go down that road too far, especially if your patrons were, Italian cardinals and popes. Okay then, so how does one go about thinking like a Greek? What were the Greeks thinking? What were their aims in art? Well, Winckelmann's interpretation, and again, we must remember that that's what it is. It's an interpretation. This is Winckelmann's own conclusion resulting from his study. Winckelmann's interpretation can be summed up in one beautiful German phrase, edle Einfalt und stille Größe, noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. So let's quote a passage again from Winckelmann's work, which explains this idea of noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. Quote, "The general and most distinctive characteristics of Greek masterpieces are, finally, a noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, both in posture and expression. Just as the depths of the sea always remain calm, however much the surface may rage, so does the expression of the figures of the Greeks reveal a great and composed soul, even in the midst of passion. Such a soul is reflected in the face of Laocoon, and not in the face alone, despite his violent suffering. The pain is revealed in all the muscles and sinews of his body, and we ourselves can almost feel it as we observe the painful contraction of the abdomen alone, without regarding the face and other parts of the body. This pain, however, expresses itself with no sign of rage in his face or in his entire being. He emits no terrible screams, for the opening of his mouth does not permit it. It is rather an anxious and troubled sighing. The physical pain and the nobility of soul are distributed with equal strength over the entire body, and are, as it were, held in balance with one another. Laocoon suffers. His pain touches our very souls, but we wish that we could bear misery like this great man." Okay, so that's the quote. And if you remember, the Laocoon that Winckelmann is talking about is a masterpiece of the ancient world. It was known to Michelangelo and the Mannerists and Bernini, and is now in the Vatican Museum. Let's actually take a closer look at the Laocoon. We know that Michelangelo, who was in Rome at the time the Laocoon was excavated, was highly influenced by the powerful figure writhing in the coils of giant serpents. You can almost pinpoint the spot on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo was painting when he first saw it. His earlier figures are more typical of early Renaissance fresco work, but at some point, the figures start to grow larger and beefier, and they twist and they spiral, at times somewhat needlessly, but always beautifully. And of course, this influenced the Mannerists, who made their figures more beefy and more twisty, and onto Bernini, whose figures reach the apogee of this muscled spiral action in works like his David and his Pluto and Persephone. But here's Winckelmann saying, no, you got it all wrong. The twisty beefcake of the Laocoon, he only looks like that so that you can more closely connect to his emotions. It's not just for show. It's not bravura modeling. It's not because it looks cool. I mean, Laocoon was a Greek priest. He wasn't a Hercules, right? You can see all his muscles, says Winckelmann, in order that you might get the sense that his agony extends to every part of his body. Again, in Winckelmann's own words, the expression of such nobility of soul goes far beyond the depiction of beautiful nature. The artist had to feel the strength of this spirit in himself, and then impart it to his marble. If the artist had clothed him, as would indeed befit his station as a priest, Laocoon's pain would have lost half its expression. Bernini even claimed to detect in the rigidity of one of Laocoon's thighs the first effects of the snake's venom. All movements and poses of Greek figures not marked by such traits of wisdom, but instead by passion and violence, were the result of an error of conception, which the ancient artists called parenthesis. The portrayal of suffering alone in Laocoon would have been parenthesis. Therefore, the artist, in order to unite the distinctive and noble qualities of the soul, showed him in an action that was closest to a state of tranquility, even for one in such pain. The common taste of artists today, especially the younger ones, is in complete opposition to this. Nothing gains their approbation but contorted postures and actions in which bold passion prevails. They call this art executed with spirit. Their favorite term is contrapposto, which represents for them the essence of a perfect work of art. In their figures they demand a soul which shoots like a comet from their midst. That's pretty strong stuff, right? So here's Winckelmann just calling out the entire age of the Baroque as a bunch of posers when it comes to the emulation of the ancients. For Winckelmann, true classic art is a reflection not of the ideal body, but of the ideal soul. So if you adapt for a moment Winckelmann's point of view that the expression of a Greek statue must reflect a great and composed soul even in the midst of passion, well, then we can start to make sense of all the neoclassical work which we know that follows. All this work with seemingly blank, expressionless, idealized faces and rather cookie-cutter, ideal bodies, right? The idea is that you're not supposed to be looking at the face, but rather past the face and into the soul of the subject of the sculpture. In this sense, the statues become true icons, right? They are abstracted symbols of a higher reality. The physical fabric of the sculpture is just pointing the way towards the truth. It should not be mistaken for truth itself. And as for virtuosity in marble carving, like the laurel leaves in Bernini's Apollo and Daphne, or the fingers of Pluto sinking into the flesh of Persephone's thigh, these are just distractions, keeping the soul of the viewer of the artwork tied to the realm of the physical, when we should be contemplating the metaphysical. Now, what a breath of fresh air Winckelmann's thoughts must have been to many artists working at the time. Now, this essay was published in 1755, and to put that in context, Italy and many other regions of Europe had been churning out increasingly meaningless and repetitive Roman Baroque work without really evolving a style for nearly a century. Meanwhile, 1755 was smack dab in the middle of the reign of Louis XV, a king whose reign was as out of touch with his people as the official artistic style was, which is now known as the Rococo style. Sculpture at the time really seems to have lost its way. No one before Winckelmann knew where else to turn. You either went to the now empty theatrical passions of the Baroque or to the frivolous decorations of the Rococo. Winckelmann seemed to offer a new way to approach the ancients, one that could revitalize and give new meaning and purpose to the study of the classics. Well before the sculptural style became known as Neoclassicism, it was commonly referred to as true art. That tells us a lot about people's opinions of the art that came before it. Winckelmann's 1755 essay was only the first of several influential works that he published during his lifetime, and his growing fame afforded him new opportunities of study. The King of Poland was in fact so impressed by Winckelmann's first essay, he gave Winckelmann a grant of money large enough to go to Rome and study independently for a few years. So Winckelmann went to Rome and stayed for most of the rest of his life. He studied art and antiquities independently. He made a lot of artist friends, and he received a series of positions and official appointments which granted access to all that Rome had to teach. He was a librarian and custodian of several important private libraries and became a Vatican prefect of antiquities. He published several other treatises and books, but his greatest contribution, after his initial influential essay, was published in 1764, and in English it's simply called The History of Art in Antiquity. By the time this work was published, Winckelmann had become basically the most knowledgeable person in the world on the arts of the ancients, and that included Rome, Greece, the Etruscans, and the Egyptians. And it is with this book that the history of art history turns a page. Winckelmann is credited with being the first modern archaeologist, applying scientific method and research into the study of the past. He was one of the first to place the art of antiquity in chronological order, using both physical and historical written evidence. He was capable of making distinctions between what statues were Greek, what statues were Roman, and then what statues were Roman copies of Greek work. Now, this was all new with Winckelmann, and it was a revolution in thinking about the art of the past. And perhaps most importantly, he cast art history itself in an entirely new light. Winckelmann was the first to use the art of the ancients as a record of the civilizations which created it. Now, once he had categorized and put all the works of art into chronological order in a given civilization, he realized that the works, taken as a whole, tell a story of that civilization, of its growth, its maturity, its decline. He united the chronology of the art with the history of the people who produced it, and found that the art revealed a lot about the politics, religion, socio-political trends, and intellectual interests of the ancients. Now, nowadays, we tend to think that that is what art history actually is, right? I mean, that's the task of being an art historian, is to do exactly what Winckelmann did. But it all started with Winckelmann. So his life's work effectively armed the artists of the late 18th century with a few new and powerful tools, right? There's a new, rational, and meaningful way to approach the work of antiquity, which allowed contemporary artists to align themselves more closely with what was seen as the true aims of true art, more than ever before. Through rational inquiry and scientific discovery, artists now felt that finally, after centuries of pursuit, modern artists had gotten under the skin of the ancients. It wasn't just about the technical ability or refined taste evident in Greek art. It was about the quality of soul which found its true expression there. And the first artist to explore this new understanding of art was a painter who knew Winckelmann personally. He was the director of the Vatican School of Painting, and himself a painter widely regarded as the best of his day. Anton Mengs. He was a fellow German who lived in Rome and befriended Winckelmann. Mengs was an enthusiastic follower of Winckelmann's ideas, even if Mengs really never seemed to completely shrug off the Baroque style. But after the untimely murder of Winckelmann in 1768, only 4 years after the publication of his History of Art in Antiquity, it was Mengs who imparted a sense of what the true style of this new classicism could be to a Prix-de-Rome student newly arrived in Rome in 1775, a painter by the name of Jacques-Louis David. Within a decade, David would secure his place in history with the neoclassical masterpiece, The Oath of the Horatii. Now, through the teaching of Mengs, the writing of Winckelmann, and the example of Jacques-Louis David, the 1780s saw the neoclassical movement bloom, from its natural origins in Rome, spread to Paris, to Germany, to Russia, to England, finally supplanting the Baroque and ushering in the modern age. All right, now that we have a basic understanding of the progression of the arts during the 1770s and 1780s, the next several art history podcasts will make a lot more sense, as the Enlightenment and Neoclassicism, engendered by Winckelmann and others, form a backdrop, as I said before, to the lives and the work of people like Jean-Antoine Houdon, Antonia Canova, Lorenzo Bartolini, and many, many others we will be talking about down the road. Before I go, I just want to make a correction to an earlier podcast. In my second episode on Bernini, I talked about the monument to Maria Raggi, as well as Michelangelo's Risen Christ, the statue of the Risen Christ. I mentioned them as being located in St. Peter's in Rome, and that is wrong. Of course it is. They are both located in Santa Maria sopra Minerva. It was a boneheaded mistake. I apologize. What it is, I write out these podcasts, fairly explicitly, but I like to stray kind of off script when I can, just to keep the tone as conversational as possible, rather than having it sound like me just reading a book report or something. And making a mistake like this is the price I pay for that. So anyway, thanks to listener Brian for catching me on that little slip-up. And of course, if any of you find fault or have a different opinion on the opinions I give, or just want to contribute to the conversation, you can do so at our thriving Facebook group page. Join up and join in the conversations there. You can always contact me as well through the Facebook group page or through the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com. And thanks once again for listening.